Grover Glenn Norquist is an American political activist and tax reduction advocate. He's the founder and president of Americans for Tax Reform. It's an organization that opposes all tax increases. Norquist founded the group in 1985 at President Reagan's request. Grover, thanks so much for coming.
Good to be with you.
Grover, you're well known for your weekly economic meetings in D.C. with many key decision makers and lawmakers. Do Republicans have a concrete plan for taming inflation, or are they going to use it as an opportunity to maybe attack the current administration on the run-up to elections?
Well, I think it's both. First of all, you criticize the Biden administration for spending $2 trillion last year for no effect. Economic growth was not any stronger than it was expected to be without the $2 trillion. And that just printed money and gave us the inflation that Biden put together. So stop printing money, stop spending like crazy. That's the plan. And one has to keep reminding people where inflation comes from, because Biden seems to think it's temporary and caused by Russians. It preceded Russia being mean to Ukraine by 9 months or so, maybe more. And also it's caused by printing too much money. Greedy businessmen was the other thing that caused inflation. It seems that when Trump was president, businessmen were not greedy.
Did you approve of Trump's stimulus plan at the beginning of the pandemic?
I think he got talked into a mistake there. We shouldn't have shut down. We now know that Sweden and those states that didn't shut down did better. They were lied to as to how bad the pandemic was going to be. They said 5 million Americans would get killed, the experts who had a secret model. But the model they didn't share with anybody, and it turned out to be nonsense. The key lesson there is if somebody tells you they've got a model either for global warming or a pandemic, put it on the internet so everybody can see it and either say, oh, that's a reasonable model, or I think there's some questions here, rather than having experts tell us what we have to do.
So what's the Republicans' plan?
Well, don't spend so much money, stop spending like crazy, stop printing money, and then importantly making sure that the tax cuts that Trump and the Republican Party passed in 2017, which gave us strong economic growth. And we are benefiting today from the strong economic growth with the base of the economy, where it hasn't been shut down, because the corporate rate came down. It used to be 35%, which is higher than China's 25%, higher than Europe's average of about 20%. We were uncompetitive in world markets on tax policy alone. So we need to continue that, but then also go further to 15%, not 21, but 15, because many states have a corporate income tax at the state level. So if we're at 15, we're really at 20. And now that we're at 21, we're really at 26. So we need to keep that tax rate down so that we can be competitive with the rest of the world on the cost of government. We don't want to compete on lower wages. We want to compete on lower taxes, less regulation, low energy prices.
They sound like pro-growth policies. It sounds a little bit of mixed messaging coming from D.C. The Federal Reserve seem to think we have too much growth. They're raising interest rates to slow growth and to slow progress in the labor market.
That's because the left, the Democrats, believe when the government spends money, that's pro-growth. It's pro-inflation. It's not necessarily pro-growth. As the Biden administration projected last year, we got about that many jobs. But they put $2 trillion in because they said they were going to do better than that. They spent $2 trillion and the economy did no better than was projected before they took office. So that was a wasted $2 trillion. It made inflation go crazy. We're at 8-9% now and getting worse. It's not transitory. It's painful.
Did you approve of the bipartisan infrastructure bill?
I understand politically why there was the sense that you needed to do the bipartisan infrastructure bill to get rid of the pressure to spend on roads and so on. So do the roads, set that aside, because Biden was originally claiming that all of his plan was infrastructure, even though most of it was welfare and paying and giving money to his friends. So if you took the part that really was sort of infrastructure, even that wasn't completely. It was sort of roads plus nonsense. But it made it possible for Congress to say no to the wholly welfare spending that Biden wanted and supposedly Build Back Better.
Anything else in the Republican plan that may help?
Well, I think take a look not just at the federal government. Look, you get rid of the death tax, you keep the Trump tax cuts going, you keep them stronger by going to a 15% corporate rate instead of a 21%, make us more competitive in the world. Reduce the regulations, and particularly the regulations and the taxes on energy. Biden's proposed budget has 35 taxes, 35 new and different and higher taxes, and then 11 of them are on energy. So he's out giving speeches about how surprised and unhappy he is that the cost of gasoline is going up, which he did all by himself. Putin had no part of that. But he now wants to raise taxes on gasoline and home heating oil and electricity, all these things that will make people poorer and make energy more expensive. So don't do any of those things. In fact, reverse those. Go back to more fracking, more looking for energy in the United States. Build pipelines, don't destroy them. All of those things that had us on track for strong economic growth before the pandemic and for keeping energy costs low.
Is the opposition to fossil fuels political?
It's completely political, because if you look at it, it's not just that they don't like fossil fuels, meaning gasoline, but they also don't like nuclear power. Well, nuclear power has no carbon in it. So if you were worried about carbon in the air, carbon dioxide, which is what we breathe out, you could either have lots fewer people, that gives you less carbon dioxide, but also you would go to nuclear. But they don't want that. They specifically want the less productive, more expensive energy, so that there is less energy available to Americans. They don't mind the Chinese building dozens and dozens of coal-fired plants, matter of fact, and they don't want to interfere with the Russians on their gasoline and natural gas. So you wonder what it is that the left wants when they say it's about global warming, but that could be solved by nuclear power.
So what is it? What do they want?
Well, what they're creating, if this is their goal, is an industry that will be under government control. And industries under government control vote for the dominant party, vote what the state wants, what the government wants, and government employees tend to vote for the party in power. Certainly if your job is at risk because you're in an industry that's only going because it's subsidized. If you're in the solar power or wind power, without subsidies, those industries don't continue in any meaningful fashion. There may be some areas where it makes sense. So you have to keep giving money. If you look at the industries that are subsidized, major donors to the Democratic Party.
And this gives them influence over these particular industries, renewable energy in this case.
Yes, and over the entire industry. If you're in charge of energy, they'd like to be in charge of the banks, which they made a try at with Dodd-Frank. They'd like to be in charge of energy. They'd like to be in charge of labor decisions. I would prefer, I think the American people would prefer, less government interference in how we get our energy, just make it less expensive and more plentiful, or how we run labor law. People should be able to negotiate their own jobs as they see fit. And I certainly don't want the government allocating capital to areas that are politically favored, because that way leads to the Teamsters pension fund instead of economic growth.
Why were they unsuccessful in controlling the traditional energy industries this way?
Because they don't need anything from government. They just want to be left alone. They don't need subsidies. I know the Democrats keep talking about how somehow there's subsidies for oil and natural gas. Find them. You know, I'd be willing to get rid of them if they had them. But there's no targeted industry subsidy for oil and natural gas.
Back to the tax cuts, are you willing to run larger deficits in the short run if we do reduce taxes even more?
Well, two things. I'd rather have spending restrained at the same time that you reduce taxes. But tax cuts very soon, almost immediately, gets you tremendous increase in investment, particularly the corporate income tax. That's money that instead of going to the government went immediately into investment in the economy. 2 years after that tax bill was passed, the median income for a family of four increased by 6.8%. That is a bigger increase in the value of the middle income family than in all 8 years of Obama. 8 years of Obama, 1 year of the Republican tax cuts gave you 6.8. That's the growth you want. That's what you're aiming for. And reducing taxes and particularly marginal tax rates gets you that economic growth.
Is cutting taxes not inflationary in the short run if the deficit does grow?
It's really a question of how much you're spending, whether you're printing more money.
Which you would be, right?
Well, hopefully all you need to do is have some restraint on the long term, and people understand what's happening long term. You certainly didn't see inflation when we had the tax cuts under Reagan. Inflation went down as the Reagan tax cuts came in, down to, was it 10, 11, 12% under Jimmy Carter, went down to 2 or 3% under Reagan while he was cutting taxes, but not increasing the supply of the money. And under Trump, he was cutting taxes, but not increasing the supply of money. And so you had low inflation with tax cuts. So the left needs to explain to us why they say tax cuts are inflationary when tax cuts have been in recent periods non-inflationary periods. The Kennedy tax cuts were not inflationary. The Johnson spending spree was inflationary. The spending spree from FDR was inflationary. The spending spree now from Biden is inflationary. That's what you have to watch out for.
Back in Reagan time with the supply side revolution, is there anything beyond just tax cuts that can be done in this space, because we have serious supply chain problems at the moment?
And that's something where we need to work on the regulations. The Jones Act, for instance, was put in to favor one particular shipping company that went between Seattle, Washington, and Alaska. They didn't want any competitors. So they came up with a rule that the boats have to be made in America and be staffed by unionized American members, and that kept out competitors. They've made that national. It's a national law, it's a federal law, and it now makes life in Hawaii very expensive because all the shipping has to be done with more expensive ships. And Puerto Rico was getting gasoline and natural gas from Russia, not from Texas, because the Jones Act made it too difficult and expensive to move things from Texas to Puerto Rico, but less expensive to bring it from Moscow, from Russia. So the Jones Act is one of those regulations that's very damaging to the supply chain, and the unions in the port of California and LA, Los Angeles, they've made it very difficult to it's one of the oldest ports in terms of the technology, that things that speed up getting things on and off ships in other ports have been stopped in California, stopped in LA by the union, which wants to maximize the number of jobs, not get the job done.
Are you saying, I believe it was Trump's Made in America plan or something similar that encouraged or maybe forced federal businesses or contractors to buy American-made products when they could? You think this was a bad idea?
If what you're saying, buy them if you can at a reasonable price, sure. But I don't think you need it if it's at a reasonable price. What we want to do is outcompete the rest of the world, not set up barriers to the rest of the world.
How do we balance that with the problems we're seeing with importing products at the moment, that so much American production has gone overseas? Where do you see the root cause of this problem coming from?
Well, when you have regulations, and we've only gotten rid of a few of the regulations. Trump, it takes more than one term to get serious deregulation, because it takes so long to write a regulation, even to get rid of an old regulation. You think it'd be easy to get rid of regulations, tough to put them in. Just as hard to take them out as to put them in. So it takes a while, and a lot was done, but not enough. We have much more to do on deregulation. All regulations added up cost about $2 trillion. If we could do half of that, free up $1 trillion, and basically take care of whatever challenges people thought they had, the reason for the regulations. But do you really need $2 trillion worth of regulations? Probably not.
You think it's purely regulation standpoint that is preventing more businesses setting up a manufacturing here? What about the strength of the US dollar vis-a-vis other currencies?
Well, the US dollar is strong when we don't print too many of them. A strong dollar is a good idea, not a bad idea. I mean, you want a dollar as good as gold in the sense that it's of stable value. You want to be able to plan on what it means. You don't want it going up and down, and that's where the Biden people have made the mistake, and the dollar has been getting weaker and weaker, which is costing the average family in the United States several $1,000s this year, and maybe $5,000 next year in less ability to buy things. That's a real hit. That's not a tax, but it's the confiscation of your wealth, of your income.
On those families, if we were to restrain and reduce government spending, would you look to Social Security, the social safety net, to do it?
I think what you should look at is what Clinton did, actually. The Republicans got Clinton to do this in the late 90s, and that was you take means-tested programs, the welfare programs, not Social Security and Medicare. People pay into those, but things like Medicaid that you pay nothing for, or food stamps that people pay nothing for, and some of the other means-tested programs where you're poor, you get money, and block grant those to the states. So all 50 states, what did we give you last year? Here's that much, and it'll grow with the economy, not any faster. If you simply do that over a decade, it saves a great deal of money, and with 50 states competing to provide the best government at the lowest cost, with welfare, the average cost in each state for welfare fell by about 30 to 40%, because they could target money to help people. And they also fought fraud, because now it was their money. Before it was just the federal government's money, who cares? But they targeted it and made sure less of it was stolen when it was run through them. So using federalism, 50 states competing, you'll get better welfare programs, less expensive welfare programs, and that brings the cost down. You want to reform government to cost less. It doesn't do any good to just slash at something. If you want to lose weight, you don't cut your arm off. You want to get rid of fat. And that's what you find when you get competition between the states.
How likely is that to happen?
I think if the Republicans had the House, Senate, and the presidency, it would happen. We were one vote away from block granting both Obamacare and Medicaid to the 50 states. And then, instead of having one big cartel, you'd have a lot of competition. People would find out, what's the best way to do insurance? What's the best way to do these various approaches on making sure that everybody has access to health care and keeping costs down? And then successful states would be saving money, and unsuccessful states would have to pay the difference for their failure. Right now, they just all call Washington and say, send more cash.
Do the states want to do it?
The red states want to do it. The competently run states want to do it, because there's already a competition on taxes. There are 8 states with no income tax, generally red states. There are another 8 states that are moving to no income tax. And this is that actually passed, Kentucky passed a law to phase out their income tax in the next 10 years. Louisiana's passed a law to phase down their income tax over the next 10, 15 years. Mississippi goes about 1/3 of the way. Arizona's down at 2.5 and then going to 0. So Iowa's making the move down. So you're seeing Georgia just took big steps towards no income tax. So these are states saying, we're going to 0. Here's our first step. Here's what we're doing this year. Here's what we're doing next year. Here's what we're doing over 10 years. And blue states are now going to have to compete not with 8 no income tax states, but 16. A lot more. And if you also give them the ability, the flexibility to run their own welfare programs, think of the advantage of living in a competently governed state over the states that just are spending and being silly about the whole thing. That will force New York, California, New Jersey to grow up and have reasonable tax levels and reasonable spending.
Mm-hmm. Maybe to finish up, you can tell me a little bit about the Taxpayer Protection Pledge and the progress you're making on it.
The Taxpayer Protection Pledge is something that Americans for Tax Reform, the group I run, shares with all candidates for office at the national level and at the state level. So governors, state legislators, congressmen, senators, about 85% of Republicans in the House and Senate have signed the pledge and kept it. Since 1994, when almost all Republicans took the pledge, and they won the House and the Senate, Republicans have held the House and the Senate more than half the time. More than 50% of the time. Before that, it was 4 years out of 62 that the Republicans had the House and Senate, so 1 out of 15 years. The Republican Party was not a competitor for running the country in Congress. Oh, presidents from time to time, but not Congress. But after '94, it controls the Congress more often than not. And so the big change is the Republican Party became the party that would never raise your taxes. Never, never, never. They may invade small countries they can't pronounce and get in trouble, but they won't raise your taxes. And that gave them control of the House and Senate more than half the time. So that has been a huge shift, and the pledge that we share makes it easy for people to know, are you a tax increaser or not? If you're not willing to put it in writing that you won't raise taxes, you're probably a tax increaser.
Is it as big an issue for voters as it was in the past?
It has consistently been a terribly powerful issue. And it's just always there. And the good news is you see its success since 1994. People vote more likely to vote into power those individuals and those parties that will not raise your taxes, state and federal.
Have all Republican congressmen, senators signed up?
More than 85% have. And it's always, there are a lot of guys who run 9 people in a district, not everyone gets to win. But of those who win, it's over 85%, and many, many more who are candidates running take the pledge as well. All the presidents since Reagan have taken the pledge. So it's, and the Republican Party has endorsed the pledge, the Republican National Committee. So it really is a commitment by most Republicans, I'll never raise your taxes. And if a Republican raises taxes, people turn on them, their own base turns on them, because even if they forgot to sign the pledge, you ran as a Republican. We trust you, we thought you could trust you.
How about the Democrats?
There used to be Democrats who signed the pledge. Most of them have switched parties and become Republicans. 2 senators, 5 congressmen, Democrats signed the pledge and then switched to the Republican Party. Others take the pledge just before they lose an election, when they're trying to save themselves. But it's now, the issue that divides the 2 parties more than any other is, will you raise taxes? Every Democrat's, the answer to that is yes, I will. And every Republican's answer is no, I won't. And so that's been the big difference. There's some other issues. There's some Democrats who won't steal your guns, but there aren't any Democrats who won't raise your taxes.
What do you think has been the most effective piece of advocacy you've done recently?
Working with the governors and state legislators on those state legislators and governors say, I want to cut taxes. And I've talked to them and say, there's a difference between saying I'm going to cut taxes 10 or 20% and saying I'm going to cut taxes 10 or 20% and my goal is to go to 0. And we're going to have triggers, so when revenue comes into a certain point, it gets cut again and again and again. The law that they passed in Kentucky, they're automatic triggers. As long as the economy is growing and revenue's coming in, you keep cutting taxes whenever new revenue comes in. So new revenue, new additional revenue from growth doesn't get taken by the special interests. It stays with taxpayers, and the tax goes down and down. You don't have to raise some other tax. You rein in spending, allow the new revenue to keep taking your income tax down, and in 10 or 15 years, any state could phase out its income tax just with normal growth.
Grover Norquist, Americans for Tax Reform. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Good to be with you.